Hello, and welcome to Sad History for Sleep. Tonight I invite you to settle in, wherever you are in the world. Maybe you're lying beneath soft sheets, or drifting beneath a dim golden lamp. Perhaps the night air hums gently outside your window, or you're simply listening, with eyes half closed, letting your mind slow its pace. Wherever you are, and whatever time it may be, let us know in the comments. It's always comforting to see where our shared curiosity takes us. And if this quiet journey into the past brings you a moment of peace, feel free to leave a like and subscribe for more stories softly told. Now, take a deep breath, let it out slowly, and imagine yourself transported, not through thrill, but through gentle curiosity, to a place where history sleeps uneasily beneath the sand. Tonight, we journey to Libya. Not the Libya you see today, torn by the echoes of rebellion and reform, but the Libya of yesterday, where every corner held a shadow, every friend might be a watcher, and where silence was a form of survival. This is a story of fear dressed in uniform, of families whispering behind closed doors, of breadlines, secret prisons, and slogans painted over silence. This is what it felt like to live under Muammar Gaddafi. Imagine yourself waking up not with plans, but with caution. The air is dry, warm, thick with stillness. In a small apartment on the edge of Tripoli, the curtains are drawn, not to keep the light out, but to keep prying eyes from looking in. The room is modest, a rug worn thin from years of quiet pacing. A chipped porcelain cup still holds yesterday's tea. A transistor radio murmurs in the corner. State news, calm and ever repeating. The voice on the radio speaks slowly, but never says very much. Praise for the brother leader. Praise for the revolution. Praise for unity. Outside, you hear footsteps, a door shutting, someone laughing too loudly, and then suddenly too little. In Libya under Gaddafi, laughter had to be measured. Joy, like grief, had to be practiced in private. You walk to the market, not to choose what you'll eat today, but to see what's available, if anything. The shelves are often half empty. Sugar, rice, flour. Sometimes they arrive. Sometimes not. The sanctions have made everything harder, but even before the world closed its doors to Libya, the scarcity was familiar. Not a natural famine, not the wrath of climate, but scarcity by control. You wait quietly in line, eyes down. Not everyone in the queue is there to buy food. Some are there to listen, to remember names, to see who is talking. In Libya, everyone knew the joke. The walls had ears, and the ears had pens. This constant surveillance did not feel like war. It was quieter, slower, more exhausting. A low-level hum of suspicion that never went away. You might remember your neighbor, Fatima, disappeared last spring. No one speaks of her now, not openly. She used to be vocal, too vocal. Her sister still comes to hang laundry on the line, hands trembling. And then there was Yusuf, a teacher. One day he gave a lesson about Greek democracy. The next, he was gone. Rumors say he was taken to Abu Salim, but of course, no one knows for sure. And it's safer not to ask. At night, you try to sleep, but even dreams feel watched. You keep your green book, Gaddafi's ideological manual, on the table, in view, not because you believe in it, but because not having it there would raise questions. A simple visit from a neighbor might trigger your heart to pound. Are they really here to borrow salt, or are they testing your loyalty? It's hard to know, and harder still to trust. Children grow up early in this world. They know what not to say at school. They know not to ask why the television only speaks in praise. They know to repeat phrases, even if they do not understand them. The revolution is eternal. The brother leader is our father. Libya needs no parliament, only the people's will. But what is the people's will when the people cannot speak? Daily life becomes a dance of invisibility. Stay quiet, stay useful, be small, and above all, be loyal, or at least appear to be. Because in Gaddafi's Libya, there were no true civilians. Everyone was part of the performance. Doctors, tailors, students, mothers. Each had a script, and even silence could be mistaken for rebellion. Even in the home, trust was never whole. Children might repeat something said in privacy, not to be cruel, but because they didn't understand the danger. And sometimes the regime rewarded such honesty. Imagine what that does to love, to family, when a careless word could cost your father his freedom. Some found escape in religion, though Gaddafi kept that under his watchful eye too. Others escaped into apathy. Numbness became its own form of resistance. Still, life carried on. It always does. Weddings still happened, though celebrations were subdued. Babies were still born, though their futures were quietly mourned. Even beauty persisted, quietly. The call to prayer rising over white rooftops, children's voices echoing in alleyways, the smell of cumin and mint tea and sweat from the day's heat, and yet, always, a shadow underneath. The rhythm of their lives was slow, repetitive, cautious. Not because it was peaceful, but because it had to be. There was no battlefield, no tanks in the streets, just the constant quiet war against thought. And in that war, it was not the loud who were lost first. It was the honest, the curious, the hopeful. They say you wouldn't last a day under Gaddafi, not because of what you'd see, but because of what you wouldn't be allowed to say, or feel, or trust. And now, as you lie there, drifting perhaps, you begin to understand. This was not a war with weapons. It was a war on reality, and that can be the most exhausting war of all. As you lie still and your breathing settles into a soft rhythm, let us step backward into time, beyond the curfews and whispers, beyond the eyes behind the curtains, and drift into the story of the man behind the curtain himself. To understand the shadow that stretched across the daily lives of Libyans, we must gently uncover the roots that gave it form. This is the rise and slow collapse of the man called brother leader, Muammar Gaddafi. He was born under an open sky in 1942 in a modest Bedouin tent in the barren region of Qasr Abu Hadi, near the town of Sirte in the Libyan desert. There were no marble halls in his beginnings, no gilded palaces, only sand, silence, and the harsh freedom of nomadic life. His family was poor, like so many others, goat herds, eking out a living in a land more accustomed to sun and stone than harvest or comfort. But even then, the boy named Muammar stood apart. Observers would later describe him as intense, withdrawn, possessed by an almost private fire. He grew up during a time when Libya, newly freed from Italian colonial rule, was still finding its feet under a Western-backed monarchy. The monarchy of King Idris, elegant yet aloof, represented order to some, but to others it symbolized submission to foreign hands that still quietly tugged at the strings of oil, politics, and power. Imagine a young Muammar under a dim desert sky, listening to pan-Arabist broadcasts from Egypt, absorbing the voice of Gamal Abdel Nasser, the charismatic Egyptian president who dreamed of Arab unity, of throwing off the shackles of the West. For Gaddafi, this was more than politics, it was a calling. In 1969, at the age of just 27, he led a bloodless military coup that toppled the monarchy while King Idris was abroad receiving medical treatment. It happened quietly, swiftly, like a sudden gust of wind scattering old leaves. Libyans awoke not to gunfire, but to new orders, new symbols, and a new voice that would come to saturate every corner of public and private life. He called himself brother leader, guide of the revolution, never president, never king. These titles, he insisted, were trappings of Western decadence. Instead, he portrayed himself as a humble servant of the people, a steward of a new, more equitable order. His ideology, woven from threads of socialism, Islam, and personal vision, was soon crystallized in a slim volume known simply as the Green Book. More on that later. At first, there was optimism. He spoke of ending corruption, nationalizing oil wealth for the people, and creating a stateless society where all would be equal. He closed Western military bases, nationalized industries, and stood boldly against imperialism. In many corners of the Arab world, he was hailed as a fearless new force, a lion from the desert roaring for justice.
But beneath the surface, cracks formed early. Gaddafi's rule became erratic, almost theatrical. He altered the country's flag to a single shade of green. The colour of Islam, yes, but also of his own doctrine. He built monuments and grandiose symbolic projects, some incomplete, some absurd in scale. He lived in a tent on diplomatic visits, even in world capitals, insisting on his Bedouin identity while quietly amassing wealth, silencing dissent and nurturing a cult of personality. He was charming in his way. He smiled often. He laughed easily in interviews. He called journalists my friends. Yet behind the warmth lay volatility. Those who disagreed with him vanished. Those who fled were hunted, even abroad. He supported rebel groups across Africa and the Middle East, seeking to extend his vision of anti-Western revolution. His hands, though clean in front of the cameras, often reached into bloodier shadows. And as the years stretched on, the contradictions deepened. His policies grew more repressive, his speeches longer, more rambling. His grip on reality, some would whisper, became uncertain. The world watched, half amused, half alarmed, as he addressed the United Nations with wild accusations, as he waved ancient texts and tore pages from charters before shocked diplomats. But at home, few were laughing. The man who once claimed to uplift his people now ruled through fear and spectacle. The line between loyalty and survival blurred beyond recognition. Even those in power had reason to look over their shoulders. Still, for over 4 decades he endured, and then the silence broke. In 2011, the Arab Spring swept across North Africa and the Middle East like a quiet tide turned storm. In Tunisia, in Egypt, long-standing leaders fell to the will of the streets. In Libya, the murmurs of discontent became a thunder. It began in Benghazi, with protesters chanting for reform. The regime's response was swift and brutal. What might have been a wave of change became civil war. Rebels rose, the army fractured, NATO intervened from above, and the once untouchable brother leader found himself abandoned, cornered, hunted. In October of 2011, he was captured near his hometown of Sirte. His rule finally ended where his life had begun. His death was chaotic, violent, filmed on mobile phones. There were no trials, no farewells, just silence and dust, and the low moan of a chapter closed not by peace, but by force. And yet, even as his body was laid to rest in an unmarked grave, his legacy did not vanish. Like footprints in dry earth, the mark he left endured. Let us now step beyond the man, beyond the spectacle, and into the shadows behind the palace walls. While the people of Libya scraped by, enduring fear and hunger, others lived a life few could imagine. In the quiet spaces between power and paranoia, what did life look like among the elite? As we move deeper into this story, let the breath guide us like a lantern in the dark. Inhale softly. And as you exhale, imagine the world behind the palace gates, far from the bustling souks and silent alleyways, far from the ration lines and whispered dissent. While the masses endured Gaddafi's erratic rule with a mix of fear, resignation and hope, a very different life unfolded in the shadows of Tripoli's opulent villas, hidden compounds and armoured convoys. This was the realm of the elite, those closest to the brother leader, his children, his bodyguards, his ministers. and his trusted enablers. To the public, he insisted he was a man of the people, but within his heavily guarded residences, lavish, secret and sprawling, there existed a world where luxury knew no limits. Imported marble floors, gold-plated fixtures, indoor waterfalls, and underground bunkers disguised as wine cellars. Exotic animals wandered lush private gardens, and deep beneath the earth, hidden tunnels allowed Gaddafi and his family to escape or move unseen. His sons, particularly the flamboyant Saadi and the ambitious Saif al-Islam, lived like royalty in a republic. They travelled with armed entourages, hosted champagne-fueled parties with foreign models, and spent millions on art property and European football clubs. Saadi bought his way onto an Italian Serie A team. Saif collected PhDs and Picasso paintings in equal measure. The illusion of intellectualism cloaked privilege, but the illusion rarely held. Gaddafi's inner circle became a mirror, one warped by loyalty, greed and paranoia. Ministers feared his moods, generals feared his wrath. Every meeting was a performance, every word weighed. To speak too freely was dangerous, to stay silent too long, equally perilous. Even his personal security detail reflected his contradictions. Known as the Amazonian Guard, his all-female bodyguards were dressed in pressed military uniforms, trained in combat, and carefully selected for both loyalty and appearance. He said they were a symbol of women's empowerment, but whispers leaked. Some spoke of exploitation, others of fear wrapped in ceremony. And beneath all of this, behind the white leather chairs and perfumed halls, was the vast machinery of wealth. Libya's oil revenues flowed like a subterranean river beneath the desert, and from that river, Gaddafi drank deeply. Billions were funneled into secret offshore accounts, luxury properties in London, Paris and Geneva, and gifts for allies and collaborators. Some say even Western leaders were charmed by his money, if not his methods. Yet even in all this splendour, there was no peace. The closer one stood to the sun of Gaddafi's favour, the more uncertain the footing. Ministers were dismissed without warning. Generals were humiliated publicly. Friends were watched, then suddenly gone. It was not trust that held his circle together. It was fear, a quiet, choking kind of fear, the kind that teaches even the rich and powerful to tread carefully. And for ordinary Libyans, this inner world remained out of reach, visible only through gossip, glances, or the occasional photograph that slipped past the regime's control. So while mothers stood in long lines for sugar and bread, and students studied by candlelight during blackouts, the elite feasted on imported delicacies flown in from Europe, sipped fine wines behind blackout curtains, and danced to Western music in underground clubs where the revolution was just a word, distant, muffled, ignored. But even palaces are built on sand, and no fortress, no matter how gilded, can silence a nation's heartbeat forever. Now, let us turn our gaze to those voices, the everyday people of Libya, the shopkeepers, the students, the fathers and daughters who lived under the weight of this regime. In the next segment, we will walk gently through the silent struggles of life under Gaddafi's rule, the world that many endured and few dared to speak of. Let your breath steady once more, and gently now, let your thoughts drift from the marble corridors of opulence to the hum of the television set in a modest Libyan home, the soft flicker of state news, the cautious eyes of a family gathered in silence, watching what they already know, not for information, but for confirmation of what must be said, what must be believed. In Gaddafi's Libya, truth was a fragile thing, not something found, but something handed down, shaped, trimmed, and delivered by the regime. If daily life was governed by fear, then the airwaves were governed by illusion. There was only one television station, one official voice. Jamahiriya TV, named after Gaddafi's self-styled State of the Masses, broadcast a steady stream of speeches, announcements, and carefully curated images. The content was repetitive and controlled, ceremonial footage, interviews with obedient citizens, and long readings from Gaddafi's Green Book. Each word was deliberate, each message woven with a subtle undercurrent. Loyalty is safety. The press too was bound. Newspapers printed what they were told. There were no editorials of dissent, no satire, no political cartoons, no critical journalism. Even weather reports avoided anything that could be twisted into subtext. The regime understood that silence was not enough. The absence of criticism had to be filled with praise. Gaddafi's face was everywhere, on billboards, on currency, in murals along highways. Not a traditional presidential portrait, but stylized images. His face wrapped in tribal robes, beneath slogans like "All power to the people" and "Direct democracy now." They weren't just declarations, they were reminders. Symbols meant to reinforce his omnipresence, not only in the political landscape but in the very imagination of the people. Propaganda reached schools too. Children were taught to memorize passages from the Green Book in place of critical thought. History lessons were rewritten to glorify the revolution, to erase imperialist influence, and to place Gaddafi at the center of every national achievement. To question the narrative was to question Libya itself, and so many didn't. Not out loud, but within homes, behind drawn curtains, whispered conversations told another version of the truth. A neighbour's son disappeared last week. A cousin sent to prison for a joke made too loudly in a coffee shop. A teacher reassigned after asking too many questions. These whispers were quiet, uncertain, but they were real. And in those spaces between propaganda and reality, a different kind of awareness grew. One formed not through confrontation, but through careful survival. Gaddafi also engaged the world through a different kind of spectacle. He saw himself not just as a ruler, but as a philosopher and Pan-African leader. He gave long, rambling speeches to foreign journalists, dressed in flowing robes of burnt orange and gold. His words often spiraled, disconnected from the questions asked. Still, they were broadcast across the globe, and in Libya they were treated like scripture. Radio played patriotic music. Posters called on citizens to report traitors. Libraries carried only state-approved texts. Foreign media was banned or heavily restricted, and satellite dishes, when allowed, were monitored. The regime's goal was not merely to inform, but to shape the very parameters of thought. And then there was the theatre of public rallies. Tens of thousands gathered in green uniforms, waving flags, chanting slogans. Some were sincere, many were compelled, but all were recorded. A visual chorus of unity, broadcast again and again to prove to the world, and to Libyans themselves, that dissent was not just unwise, it was unthinkable. It is difficult to overstate the quiet force of this kind of psychological control. When every channel says the same thing, when every book agrees, when your neighbours watch you watching the news, it becomes hard to hold on to your own voice, and that too was the point. Still, even under this crushing sameness, resistance found cracks. Satellite dishes hidden under laundry lines, foreign radio stations tuned in after midnight when the city slept, subtle graffiti, sometimes just a word, quickly scrubbed away by dawn, and people who remembered another time, or imagined a different one. In this world of shadows and spectacle, where words were weapons and silence a shield, one group lived a life full of contradiction and quiet complexity. They were both symbols of modernity and victims of patriarchy, both praised and controlled. In our next segment, we step into the lives of women under Gaddafi's rule. Take a slow breath in, and as you release it, allow your mind to settle into a delicate space, one of contradiction, of tension, of lives lived at the edge of revolution and restraint. In the speeches and pages of the Green Book, Gaddafi proclaimed that women were equal to men. He declared that the liberation of women was essential to the revolution. On paper, his Libya offered bold strides. Education for girls, legal protections for wives, opportunities for women to work and hold office. To many in the region it seemed, at least at first, like a radical break from the past. In reality, the story was far more complex. Gaddafi established all-female military units, famously the Revolutionary Nuns or his Amazonian Guard, a striking spectacle of power. They wore flowing uniforms, sometimes heels, and trained in martial arts. In state propaganda, they were symbols of modernity, strength, and liberation. But behind the image, darker truths emerged. Former members later spoke of being chosen as teenagers, taken from their homes, promised elite status, and instead subjected to isolation, control, and, in many cases, abuse. Reports would surface long after his death of sexual violence and coercion at the hands of the regime. These women, trained to protect Gaddafi, had often been groomed to serve him in far more troubling ways. And yet, not all stories were the same. In urban centres like Tripoli and Benghazi, many women did rise, becoming doctors, engineers, lawyers, and professors. University classrooms saw increasing numbers of women, and state-run industries opened their doors. There was a moment, a delicate window, when possibilities expanded. But always under watchful eyes. Progress was permitted, not guaranteed. Rights were given, but never secure. The state could elevate or revoke them at will. In rural Libya, the picture remained even more conservative. Traditional structures held firm. Family honour and tribal customs often outweighed state policy. There, the rhetoric of the Green Book met the unshakable weight of history. For many women outside the capital, the promises of revolution rang hollow. Marriage laws were another reflection of this divide. In theory, women could refuse arranged marriages, pursue divorce, and retain custody of children. But in practice, the courts often favoured men, and social pressure was suffocating. Domestic abuse was seldom reported, and when it was, rarely prosecuted. The legal reforms Gaddafi introduced were inconsistent, often contradictory, and always filtered through his personal ideology. This paradox defined the female experience in Libya: empowerment wrapped in performance, visibility shadowed by control. In schools, girls were taught to read the Green Book and memorize its claims of gender equality. In reality, those same girls faced dress codes, surveillance, and the threat of being labelled disloyal if they stepped beyond acceptable lines. Modesty was encouraged but not mandated, until suddenly it was. Women's behaviour was a constant negotiation between what the law permitted and what society permitted and what Gaddafi expected. Some of the regime's most painful contradictions lived within the very bodies of these women. Praised as symbols, used as tools, spoken of as free, yet seldom allowed the space to choose their own direction without consequence. Still, there were quiet acts of rebellion. Women wrote poetry, coded with critique. They gathered in kitchens and whispered ideas. Some used their positions in universities and hospitals to speak truth gently, in ways that couldn't be immediately punished. Others simply endured, holding on to hope that one day their daughters might live with fewer masks. These were not just stories of victimhood. They were stories of resilience, of navigating power in its most intimate forms, and even in the heart of contradiction, they found ways to preserve dignity and selfhood. As we leave this chapter of silent resistance and symbolic liberation, we move toward the place where all stories converge, the moment of fracture when the illusions could no longer hold and the streets themselves began to speak. Next, we explore the early tremors of the Libyan uprising, the flickers of revolution that would crack the regime's long-standing facade. Let us now turn inward, into the shadows. Imagine yourself walking through the streets of Tripoli or Misrata, not under the sun's warmth, but under the weight of watching eyes, eyes you cannot see, faces you may know, or think you do. In Gaddafi's Libya, silence was safety. Conversation, real, unguarded conversation, was a dangerous indulgence. Words, once spoken, could unravel a life. In every neighbourhood, every office, every classroom, there could be someone listening, and even if they weren't, the fear that they might be was often enough. Gaddafi's internal security apparatus was vast, layered, and deeply embedded into the fabric of everyday life. It was not simply a matter of secret police. It was a culture, cultivated deliberately, of suspicion, betrayal, and the slow erosion of trust. At the centre of it all was the Mukhabarat, the intelligence services. Under various names and subdivisions, this sprawling network reported directly to Gaddafi. They kept tabs on suspected dissidents, returned exiles, intellectuals, and even loyal supporters who rose too high or grew too popular. But perhaps the most insidious aspect wasn't the official agents. It was the ordinary people enlisted, coerced, or tempted into informing. Imagine being offered a favour, perhaps a job for your son, a scholarship abroad, protection from a minor criminal charge, in exchange for small pieces of information. A neighbour's complaint, a colleague's offhand remark, a cousin's strange absence, or worse still, imagine being told that if you didn't inform, someone else would. Young university students were sometimes recruited without knowing they were entering a system that would later demand more than they ever intended to give. Teachers, shopkeepers, postal workers, mosque imams, None were beyond the reach of the regime's invisible hand. The result was a hollowing out of social life. Weddings and family gatherings became carefully managed events where every word, every glance was weighed. Children were taught never to repeat their parents' opinions outside the home. Phones were tapped, mail intercepted, foreign visitors were followed. Even the walls, it was said, could have ears. There are stories, many stories, of people disappearing, not always with warning. Sometimes in the middle of the night, taken by men in plain clothes and never seen again. Sometimes they returned years later, changed. Often they didn't return at all, and yet people adapted. Some withdrew completely. Others lived a double life, speaking the language of loyalty in public, while burying their doubts deep in the silence of their minds. Occasionally someone tried to resist, to speak, to publish, to organize. These attempts were met with swift and public consequences, trials without transparency, long imprisonments, torture, whispered of but never acknowledged. And always the message was the same: silence is survival. Even within the regime, betrayal was currency. Ministers turned on ministers, bodyguards disappeared, loyalty was rewarded until it wasn't. Gaddafi ruled not through trust, but through careful imbalance, ensuring that no one felt secure enough to challenge him. Divide, observe, control. This web of distrust outlived many of its architects. Even after the fall, the fear lingered. Some former informants vanished during the civil war. Others quietly disappeared into the post-revolutionary shadows, their past unspoken but suspected. In this way, the regime didn't only police opposition, it rewired relationships, redefined trust, and quietly fractured the soul of a nation. Now, let the air settle once again. The heaviness of fear is not easily shaken, even in memory. But for those living through the sanctions and international isolation that defined much of Libya's later years, the pressures only grew more acute. As we move gently from the inward paranoia to the broader world pressing in, let us examine how sanctions reshaped the daily lives of Libyans, not through headlines or policy briefings, but through empty shelves, long lines, and dreams slowly fading beneath embargoes. Now let us move quietly beyond the walls of the home and into the greater machinery of daily life. Shops, schools, hospitals, borders. Imagine yourself standing before a grocery store in Tripoli, the afternoon sun casting a soft haze over the sidewalk. The shelves inside are not empty, but sparse. Certain items are always missing. Medicines once taken for granted are spoken of in hopeful tones. Spare parts for cars, for machines, for the simple functions of life, harder to find with each passing year. This is what it was like under the long shadow of international sanctions. The 1990s were especially bleak. In response to Libya's suspected involvement in terrorist bombings, including the tragic destruction of Pan Am Flight 103 over Lockerbie, Scotland, the United Nations imposed a sweeping set of sanctions in 1992. These were not minor restrictions. They froze assets. They banned the sale of aircraft parts. They grounded Libya's airlines. They drastically limited imports, and with them, the economic lifeblood of the country. To the average Libyan, this global condemnation was not felt as political discourse. It was felt as absence. Absence of opportunity, absence of medicine, absence of growth. Pharmacies that once stocked a wide array of medications were forced to ration or turn people away. Doctors, skilled and willing, worked with outdated tools and dwindling supplies. Hospitals darkened from power outages, their wards too often echoing with quiet desperation. Education, once a point of national pride, stagnated. Libyan students abroad found it harder to receive funds or return home. Foreign educators, already wary, became even rarer. The academic world, like the commercial, was closing itself to Libya. And then there was the economic hardship. Inflation gnawed away at wages, jobs became scarce, and prices unpredictable. The black market flourished, not out of greed, but necessity. Those with connections, often to the regime or the military, managed to navigate the shortages more easily. But for most, life became a daily act of improvisation. Fuel remained abundant. Libya, after all, was still rich in oil, but even this wealth became a bitter irony. The oil flowed, but the profits were hoarded by the powerful. The people, meanwhile, lined up for basics: flour, baby formula, cooking oil. In the midst of all this, Gaddafi used the sanctions as both a scapegoat and a symbol. On state television, he railed against Western hypocrisy. He presented Libya as a victim of imperial aggression, and himself as the last proud defender of independence. His speeches were long, wandering, sometimes incoherent, yet always returned to this theme. The world was against Libya because Libya had refused to kneel, and yet the pain was real. The isolation was real. Imagine a young Libyan engineer trained with great promise, denied access to international conferences, or a mother watching her diabetic child suffer without insulin, or a teacher using 20-year-old textbooks to teach a generation already born into silence. Still, people adapted. They always do. Communities grew tighter. Families leaned into one another. Home remedies were revived. People travelled when they could, using circuitous routes through Tunisia or Egypt to gather supplies or reconnect with loved ones abroad. The rhythm of their lives changed, but it continued. Even music changed. Satellite dishes were banned, but they appeared anyway, hidden on balconies or disguised on rooftops, bringing in fragments of foreign culture. This illicit window to the outside world was more than entertainment. It was a reminder that life was wider than the regime allowed. By the early 2000s, a slow thaw began. Negotiations, settlements, and shifting alliances led to the gradual lifting of sanctions. Flights resumed. Embassies reopened. There was a sense, brief and fragile, that Libya might emerge from its long exile. But the damage was done. Years of being cut off had eroded institutions, drained talent, and instilled a national muscle memory of doing without. And yet, even this isolation had its contradictions. For those inside Gaddafi's circle, the world had never truly closed. Their children studied abroad. Their luxuries were imported. Their reality was something else entirely. Let us now pass quietly from the dusty queues of everyday survival to the gilded corridors of Gaddafi's palaces, a contrast not just in wealth, but in perception, in the strange, surreal lives of those who lived closest to power. Now picture yourself far from the ration lines and the dimly lit clinics of ordinary Libyans. You're in a marble-floored hall where chandeliers glisten and imported fruit is arranged like a still life. This is not fiction. This is the life lived by those closest to Colonel Muammar Gaddafi. Here, isolation was not a burden, it was curated exclusivity. Gaddafi's inner circle lived in a world insulated from the consequences of his rule. His children, especially his sons, became symbols of this surreal duality, raised in revolution but seduced by Western excess. While ordinary Libyans endured shortages, his sons wore Armani, drove Ferraris, and threw lavish parties in Europe's capitals. Take Saif al-Islam, the most prominent of Gaddafi's children. Educated at the London School of Economics, he presented himself as a reformer, speaking fluently about democracy, civil society and modernisation. At home, he moved through the corridors of power with the calm entitlement of a crown prince, charming foreign dignitaries one day, suppressing dissent the next. Then there was Hannibal, known for his volatile behaviour, his nightclub escapades in Europe, and violent outbursts that made international headlines. His excesses seemed almost theatrical, an actor cast in a role of reckless privilege, while the rest of Libya lived in carefully choreographed austerity. But this contrast between the rulers and the ruled wasn't merely material, it was psychological. To live inside the regime's core was to exist in a kind of alternate reality. There were endless stories of loyalty tests, of officials being elevated and then abruptly humiliated, of conversations cut short by sudden disappearances. The regime thrived on unpredictability. One could be a minister today and an inmate tomorrow. The paranoia trickled down, ministers bugged each other, guards spied on their commanders, even family dinners were shadowed by unspoken anxieties. And yet, loyalty was not just enforced through fear, it was rewarded, with power, wealth, and protection. The price was silence, participation in the great performance, pretending, even believing, that Libya was strong, sovereign and thriving, even when it wasn't. But Gaddafi's own life was the most theatrical of all. He lived not in a single palace, but in a rotating constellation of fortified compounds across the country. Tents were erected next to villas. Camel skin rugs lay beneath French chandeliers. He travelled with a phalanx of female bodyguards, famously dressed in military-style uniforms, part symbolism, part spectacle. Foreign leaders were hosted not in opulent halls, but in desert tents pitched in the gardens of Rome or Paris, staged performances of Bedouin authenticity that masked the state-of-the-art security and diplomatic tension beneath. Every gesture was calculated, every appearance laden with contradiction. He portrayed himself as a humble man of the people, brother leader, not president, while ruling with a grip tighter than most monarchs. He claimed to have given up power through his Green Book, yet orchestrated every significant decision from behind a curtain of informal authority. The line between truth and illusion blurred, not just for outsiders, but for Libyans themselves. Was Gaddafi truly revered, or merely feared? Did he believe his own mythology, or did he use it to mask deeper insecurities? Perhaps both were true, perhaps neither mattered. For a generation of Libyans, especially those born into this reality, the regime became the atmosphere itself, omnipresent, unquestionable, woven into every news broadcast, every school book, every billboard. To imagine life without Gaddafi was like trying to imagine the sea without water. And yet, under the surface of this carefully maintained control, discontent stirred. It stirred in whispered conversations, in songs played behind closed doors, in satellite channels viewed under low light, in the memories of those who had tasted life abroad and returned home changed. That quiet rumble would one day swell into a cry. Let us now begin our slow approach to that turning point, a moment not of revolution, yet, but of reawakening. When the silence began to break and the people, so long contained, started to speak. In the late 2000s, Libya was shifting, softly, almost imperceptibly, like wind pressing against a dam. To the untrained eye, the regime still seemed impenetrable. Gaddafi remained omnipresent. His portraits loomed over roads and public squares, his voice echoed in state broadcasts, and his ideas, codified in the Green Book, were still recited in schools like sacred scripture. But underneath this orchestrated stillness, something was changing. Young Libyans, many of whom had never known a world without Gaddafi, were becoming increasingly restless. They saw their peers in Egypt, Tunisia, and even further abroad, using the internet to speak, to laugh, to argue, to organise. Facebook, though banned at times, seeped in through VPNs. YouTube clips circulated capturing moments of truth, a protest abroad, a critical word from a Libyan exile, or a song that dared to dream. It started in whispers, in coded language, in cafes and campuses where students discussed not revolution but possibilities, small things, fairness, dignity, the right to simply be, without fear, without watching over your shoulder. In Benghazi, a city long wary of Tripoli's dominance, these whispers gained volume. The east of Libya had a long memory of being marginalised, of watching oil wealth pour into the capital, while their own roads crumbled and hospitals faded. Families remembered relatives who had disappeared in prison. Some had lost sons in the infamous 1996 Abu Salim prison massacre, where over 1,000 inmates were killed in a single day. They waited years for answers. None came. But grief, like water, always seeks a crack. In 2010, as news of protests in Tunisia reached Libyan ears, the dam shuddered. Then came the match. On February 15th, 2011, in Benghazi, protests erupted over the arrest of Fatih Terbil, a lawyer representing the families of the Abu Salim victims. It wasn't a march against the regime, at least not at first. It was a call for justice, a cry that had waited 15 years to be heard. But the regime responded as it always had, with force, and something broke. By February 17th, just 2 days later, the protests had spread. No longer quiet, no longer cautious. Crowds filled the streets of Benghazi, Al-Baida, Derna. People chanted words that once only lived in secret thoughts. Freedom, dignity, down with the regime. The fear that had paralysed a nation for decades was fracturing. Libya, once a sealed box of silence, was beginning to open. Slowly, then all at once. And Colonel Gaddafi, for all his might and myth, found himself facing something his regime had not prepared for. A people no longer willing to perform. This was the beginning of the Libyan revolution. But it was not the beginning of chaos, at least not yet. It was a moment suspended between courage and consequence, a brief, bright breath before the plunge. In the next chapter, we descend into those crucial early days of uprising, when the chant of liberation spread across cities, when the army splintered, and when Libya, long held in place, began to fracture along lines invisible to the outside world, but deeply etched in its soul. Before Libya erupted in revolution, before streets became battlefields and once silent voices rang through city squares, there was a book, a small, strange book. Its cover, a soft green, its message, a mirror of one man's vision for an entire nation. The Green Book. Written by Muammar Gaddafi in the 1970s, this manifesto was both philosophy and policy, intended to serve as a complete replacement for democracy, capitalism, and communism. Gaddafi believed his Third International Theory offered a new path for human governance. In his mind, it was not merely a suggestion, it was the answer. Imagine yourself sitting in a Libyan classroom in the 1980s. The room is hot. The air smells faintly of chalk and desert dust. The teacher reads aloud not from a history book but from the Green Book. Representation is fraud. Committees must govern. Women are exactly like men. Sport is the right of all the people. The words are simple, almost childlike. But they are not up for debate. From school children to civil servants, from factory workers to professors, all were expected to read, recite and absorb the Green Book's tenets. Political parties were outlawed. Gaddafi insisted they were tools of oppression. Elections were abolished. Instead, Libya was governed through a network of people's committees, which in theory gave every citizen a voice. In theory. But reality wore a different face. The committees were largely symbolic. In practice, any dissenting opinion could lead to arrest. Citizens who voiced skepticism about the Green Book, even in casual conversation, risked disappearing. And yet, everywhere, the book remained. In government offices, schools, hospitals, in dusty homes and on shelves untouched. It was read, but rarely believed. Many Libyans came to see the Green Book not as a guide to justice, but as a symbol of irony. It promised freedom, but delivered surveillance. It spoke of equality, while nepotism and tribal favoritism thrived. It banned personal property accumulation, but Gaddafi's family grew unimaginably rich. Still, the illusion endured. In international interviews, Gaddafi would hold up the Green Book like a sacred text. He would say, "This is true democracy. There is no leader here. The people govern themselves." And in some eerie way, he may have believed it. The dissonance between Gaddafi's words and the lived experience of his people was vast. The book's utopian tone clashed painfully with daily hardship. Its insistence on communal ownership collided with shortages, blackouts, and failing infrastructure. Its declarations about women's rights seemed absurd next to the stories of exploitation and control. The Green Book also shaped Libya's foreign image. Copies were sent across Africa. Translations were funded. Gaddafi envisioned himself as a philosopher king, his ideas spreading like sand through the wind. But just as sand slips through fingers, so too did faith in the Green Book. As the 2000s dawned and information slowly crept into Libya through satellite dishes and illicit internet access, more and more Libyans saw what the outside world looked like, and they began to understand just how much had been denied them. What remained was not belief, but performance. People quoted the Green Book in official meetings. They nodded dutifully when its logic was repeated. But in the private corners of homes, in whispers and glances, they knew this was not governance, it was theatre, a performance for the sake of survival. And yet, in the final days of the regime, Gaddafi still clung to it. Even as rebel forces closed in, even as NATO jets streaked across the Libyan sky, even as cities burned and sons buried fathers in secret, he still quoted from its pages, because for Gaddafi, the Green Book was not just a political framework, it was him, his mind, his myth. But myths, however often repeated, eventually falter when met with reality. As Libya rose in revolt, the Green Book, once mandatory, once sacred, became a relic, a hollow artifact of a vanished order. Its pages, once read aloud in schools, were now left to curl in the wind. And in the absence of its voice, the sound of real voices began to rise. Up next, we will step directly into the war itself. The crackling tension of an uprising turned armed conflict, from peaceful protest to civil war, and the interventions that reshaped Libya's fate. It began not with guns, but with grief. In the eastern city of Benghazi, long neglected, long watched, there lived a quiet man named Fatih Terbil, a lawyer, a father, and the legal representative of families whose sons had vanished in a massacre the government denied ever took place. In 1996, over 1,200 prisoners were reportedly slaughtered in a single day at Abu Salim prison. For years their families waited, hoped, demanded answers. None came. Then, in February 2011, amid the growing tremors of the Arab Spring, Fatih was arrested. It was a familiar act, one that in years past would have gone unnoticed. But this time, something shifted. Within hours, a crowd gathered outside the police station in Benghazi, at first small, then swelling. Faces lit by mobile phone screens, voices unsteady but rising. They chanted for his release. They chanted for justice. They chanted for the dead. It wasn't a rebellion, not yet, but it was defiance, and in Libya that was enough to shake the air. Word spread quickly, on Facebook, through whispers, over cracked cell lines. Protests began in other cities, Beda, Derna, Tobruk, and then Tripoli. People had waited decades for the chance to be heard. Now they weren't asking, they were demanding, but the regime did not bend. It broke its silence with bullets. Security forces opened fire, live ammunition into unarmed crowds, ambulances overwhelmed, hospitals flooded, grief multiplied, again and again. And just like that, the protests turned into resistance. In Benghazi, police stations were torched, military garrisons overrun, soldiers, disgusted by the regime's violence, began to defect, sometimes turning their weapons on their own commanders. A new chant echoed through the streets. The people want to bring down the regime. It had been heard in Tunisia, in Egypt, now in Libya. But Libya's revolution would not mirror its neighbours. Where Tunisia's leader fled in weeks, and Egypt's in mere days, Gaddafi stayed. He appeared on state television, draped in brown robes, standing under a golden umbrella. His speech? Rambling, accusatory, detached. He blamed foreign agents. He blamed Al-Qaeda. He said his people loved him. He warned of rivers of blood. "I will die a martyr," he declared. "I will not leave the land of my ancestors." And with that, the conflict deepened. No longer a protest. This was now war. Cities became front lines, checkpoints, battlegrounds. Weapons, many rusted or stolen, were wielded by teachers, engineers, teenagers. Families were split across loyalties. Tribes turned inward. And across the vast Libyan desert, the old divides, east and west, Arab and Amazigh, centre and margin, began to crack open. The world watched in unease. Foreign journalists arrived. Smuggled footage surfaced. Videos of atrocities, of bravery, of fear. Gaddafi's forces were strong, well-equipped. They pushed back, retook towns, laid siege to others. And then came the voice from outside, from Paris, London, Washington. The international community, haunted by what had happened in Rwanda and Bosnia, heard the cries for help. The United Nations passed a resolution, and suddenly the skies above Libya buzzed with aircraft not of its own. French jets, British bombers, American drones. A NATO-led coalition had entered the fray, not with troops, but with air power, to protect civilians, they said, to prevent a massacre in Benghazi. Gaddafi called it colonialism. The rebels called it salvation. The tide began to turn. With each airstrike, regime bases crumbled. With each city liberated, hope surged. But the war was far from simple, and its end, when it came, was brutal, chaotic, and intimate. In our next segment, we will walk through the final days of Gaddafi himself, the fall of Tripoli, the collapse of power, and the haunting final moments of a man who once ruled unchallenged. Tripoli had always been the heart of Gaddafi's power, the city of his grand speeches, his loyal brigades, his impenetrable walls. But by late August 2011, it was unravelling. The rebels, now calling themselves the National Transitional Council, had clawed their way westward. With NATO jets overhead and defections from within the regime, they approached the capital like a tide. Fierce fighting broke out. Neighbourhoods became war zones, and amid the gunfire the people rose. The green flags were torn down, the posters defaced. The chants for Gaddafi were drowned out by cries of freedom. By the third week of August, Tripoli was no longer his. Gaddafi was gone, vanished into the vastness of Libya's interior. Rumours flew he was in Sirte, his coastal hometown, in Sabah, deep in the south, or hiding underground. But wherever he was, his empire was no longer whole. His sons, once poised as heirs, were captured or killed. His palaces, lavish beyond imagining, were looted and broadcast to the world. Golden sofas, private zoos, sprawling tunnels beneath the earth, all of it exposed. The myth of the man, dismantled piece by piece. Still, Gaddafi did not surrender. For weeks his voice crackled through hidden radio transmissions. He urged loyalists to fight, to resist, to avenge. But by October 2011 the circle had closed. Sirte, his birthplace, was under siege. Block by block it fell. On October 20th a convoy attempted to flee the city. Gaddafi was in it. NATO warplanes struck, the vehicles scattered, and the man who had once stood atop Africa's highest thrones was pulled from a drainage pipe in the dirt. There was no trial, no court, only a mob, raw with rage. Videos show him, bloodied, dazed, muttering, moments later dead. The world watched in silence. After 42 years, Muammar Gaddafi's reign was over. His body, laid on a mattress in a freezer, became a grim exhibit for the public. Thousands came. Some wept. Most did not. It was a brutal ending. But in Libya, there had been so much brutality for so long, it seemed almost inevitable. For the revolutionaries, it was a moment of triumph. A tyrant had fallen. But for Libya, the story was far from finished. Because when a strong man dies, what rises next is not always peace. In our next segment, we explore the aftermath, the struggle to build unity in a fractured land, the vacuum left behind, and the question that still haunts Libya today: was it worth it? What happens when the strongman falls and the silence is filled with echoes? The guns quieted for a moment, the green flags were lowered, the portraits burned, the slogans forgotten, and for a breath, a nation exhaled. Gaddafi was gone, but the walls he built, of fear, of distrust, of division, remained, invisible but towering. And without his hand to hold the system together, those walls began to crack in every direction. The state, once oppressive and all-consuming, had vanished almost overnight. There were no functioning courts, no national army, no trusted institutions, only the memory of repression and the uncertainty of what came next. In cities like Tripoli, Benghazi, Misrata, and Zintan, armed groups rose swiftly, each declaring themselves defenders of the revolution. But loyalty was fractured. Some pledged to Islamism, others to federalism, many simply to tribe or territory. And the young men, who had once fought side by side in the name of freedom, now found themselves staring down each other's barrels. One by one, the embers of civil war began to glow. Interim governments tried to form, elections were held, parliaments were seated and then attacked, disbanded, replaced and contested. By 2014, Libya had split once more, east against west, militias against militias, city against city. The vacuum had not drawn in peace, it had drawn in chaos. And through it all, the people, those who had waited years to speak freely, to move without fear, to dream, watched as hope slipped quietly away. Shops reopened, but with rising prices and scarce goods. Schools functioned, but war zones surrounded the playgrounds. Electricity flickered, water ran dry. Oil terminals became battlegrounds. Kidnappings surged, and foreign powers, each with their own agendas, began to cast long shadows across Libya's fractured landscape. Russia, Turkey, Egypt, the UAE, France. They supported factions, signed deals, sent drones. The land of the desert was no longer alone. And yet, even amid this fragmentation, echoes of the past remained. The secret police were gone, but many Libyans still watched what they said. The regime's buildings stood empty, but fear still lingered in the alleys. Trauma does not leave when a dictator dies. It lingers in the silences, in the way people pause before speaking, in the way they glance over their shoulders, in the way they dream. A generation has now come of age after Gaddafi, young men and women who never truly knew his rule but live with its shadow. They inherit a land shaped by paranoia, divided by design. And slowly, painstakingly, many try to heal. Grassroots organizations rebuild communities, journalists emerge telling stories once forbidden, artists paint the truth across broken walls, families displaced by violence return home, one by one. But still, Libya waits, for a government that can truly represent, for laws that protect, for a peace that lasts longer than a season. Some whisper that Gaddafi, for all his cruelty, at least brought order. It is a dangerous nostalgia, a longing not for him, but for something lost. Because history is heavy, and the weight of tyranny doesn't lift easily. As we prepare to close this journey, we look now beyond borders, to those who watched from afar, those who fled, and those who still carry Libya within them, even as they build lives far from its burning sands. In our final segment, we turn to the diaspora, to the voices that echo from exile, from coffee shops in Tunis, from apartments in Berlin and Cairo, from college dorms in Canada and beyond. The story of Gaddafi's Libya didn't end with his death. It continues in fragments across oceans, in memory. Imagine yourself now, far from the dusty streets and sun-baked plazas of Libya, perhaps in a quiet room in a foreign city where the sounds of a different language fill the air and the night feels cooler, less heavy. For many Libyans, exile was not a choice but a necessity, a step taken quietly, sometimes hurriedly, leaving behind family, homes and the familiar rhythms of daily life. The diaspora is vast and diverse. There are those who fled before the fall of Gaddafi, escaping repression or forced conscription. Others left in the chaos that followed, chasing safety and stability as Libya fractured. For these scattered souls, Libya is at once close and impossibly distant. A land carried in stories, photographs, recipes, and sometimes a constant ache. They gather in small communities, cafes filled with the scent of strong coffee and cardamom, where Arabic blends with local tongues. They celebrate the holidays they grew up with, sharing laughter and memories, passing traditions to children who have never seen the Mediterranean coast or the sprawling Sahara dunes. But in their conversations, a quieter tone often surfaces, a mix of longing and frustration, of hope tempered by hardship. Many speak of the difficulty of living between worlds, feeling neither fully at home in their new country nor able to return freely to the land they love. Some have become activists, organising protests and lobbying international governments. They work to keep Libya's story alive on the world stage, to demand justice, and to support those still inside the country struggling for peace. Others channel their experience into art, music, and literature, creating works that explore identity, displacement, and the complexities of memory. And there are those who wrestle privately with loss and silence. Missing relatives lost to war or imprisonment, grieving friends whose voices were silenced. The diaspora's perspective offers a unique lens on Gaddafi's Libya, one coloured by distance but sharpened by the sharp edges of exile. It reveals how history is not just about leaders or battles, but about the lives that ripple outward, crossing borders, reshaping futures, and sometimes sowing seeds of renewal. As night deepens and the quiet grows around you, consider this. While Libya itself may still be caught in cycles of unrest and uncertainty, the spirit of its people, inside and outside its borders, remains. They carry the stories forward, waiting for a time when their voices can merge once again with the rhythm of a land reborn. And now, as we gently prepare to bring this journey to a close, we will reflect on how the past continues to shape the present, how the legacy of Gaddafi's Libya lingers, and how hope endures even in the most fractured of places. As the echoes of exile fade softly into the background, let us turn once more toward Libya itself, the land where the shadows of history still stretch long and deep. Imagine walking slowly through streets where the dust has settled unevenly over cracked pavement. The air is dry, still carrying whispers of what once was and what might yet be. After the fall of Gaddafi, Libya did not find immediate peace or unity. Instead, it entered a time marked by uncertainty and fragmentation. The legacy of decades under an all-encompassing regime had left deep scars, a society woven with threads of distrust, fear and fractured alliances. The security forces and secret police that once operated in shadows dissolved but left behind a culture of suspicion. Neighbours wary of neighbours, families cautious in conversation. Political power splintered, shifting between rival factions, tribal groups and militias, each claiming legitimacy, each guarding their own vision for Libya's future. For many ordinary Libyans, daily life remained a cautious navigation of this new terrain, where the threat of sudden violence still lingered like a distant storm cloud on the horizon, and the simple desire for safety and stability often felt like a distant dream. Yet, amid the ruins of division, there were signs of resilience, communities reaching across divides, small acts of kindness and cooperation that hinted at the possibility of healing. The cities that had once been scenes of conflict began to stir with tentative hopes. Markets reopened, the scent of fresh bread and spices returning to the air. Children's laughter slowly filling courtyards, reminding all who listen that life, in its quiet persistence, endures. But the path forward is long and winding, a journey of rebuilding trust where it was once broken, of weaving together the many threads of a society torn apart. And so, as you lie here now, feeling the calm rhythm of your own breath, consider this delicate balance between past and future, how the weight of history rests gently, yet firmly, on the shoulders of the present. In this moment, you are part of the story too, a witness to the echoes of a world far away, and a traveller moving slowly toward rest. May this journey through Libya's recent past bring not only understanding, but also peace. A quiet reminder that even in the darkest chapters, the human spirit seeks light. As your thoughts begin to soften and your mind drifts towards stillness, thank you for sharing this time, this space, and this story. If you found this journey calming, please consider leaving a note in the comments. Where are you watching from? What time is it where you are? A like and subscription help keep these stories alive so they can continue to soothe and inspire. May your night be restful, your dreams gentle, and your morning peaceful. Good night.